Yeah, hold on. What's your email? Rachel, what's your email? What's your email? Rachel H. Dot. We're gonna get started in a moment, folks. Good to see you. Did you get it? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Since last year? No. Huh? You what? You're not. No. I just. Okay. We get started. We get started. Everyone get some food? Okay. Welcome, everybody, to this important lecture on terrorist atrocities, the war in Gaza, and the law. I'm going to ask our Quad Student Board member, Jay Shyama, second year in the college, to introduce our guest speaker.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming. It's dark outside, it's November and it's pretty late, but we're all still here. That's beautiful. We're here to welcome Professor Bell, who is honoring us tonight and here to enlighten our conversations. He is an Israeli professor of law at the University of San Diego School of Law and Bar-Ilan University's Faculty of Law. He received his BA and JD from the University of Chicago and his SJD from Harvard. He interned in the office of Israeli Supreme Court Judge Chechen, and he frequently writes about the Arab-Israeli conflict. He was formerly a visiting professor at Fordham University School of Law and the University of Connecticut School of Law, and he currently teaches classes on property and intellectual property at the University of San Diego School of Law and at Bar-Ilan University's Faculty of Law. He also serves as senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum. Please, everyone, give a warm UChicago welcome to Professor Bell.
Okay, so first of all, I got here overnight from home, which is Jerusalem. So it's now about 3:10 a.m. So if you, thank you. No. So if at some point I start stuttering, okay, you know what happened. Feel free to steer me back onto the right path. All right. So what I wanted to talk about, I took my guidelines from the title of the talk, which I was told what it was. I didn't choose it, but it's very fine title. And so it's exactly what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the atrocities of October 7th. I want to talk about the legal implications of them. I want to talk about the concept of war. I want to talk a little bit about the law of that. And I think at that point, I want to wrap up and let you steer where you want to take this afterwards. I will ask that you save questions and disagreements for the end. And it's only if you have something that's unclear to you, please, in some orderly fashion, stop me and I'll try to explain it. Okay. Let's begin with this. So October 7th, Saturday holiday, I woke up in the morning and the phone was ringing, and it shouldn't be ringing. Right. So at some point, I realized that I had to answer. And then the sirens started going off because the rocket attacks. And I discovered there was something going on. What was going on was this. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, several thousand terrorists from the Gaza Strip broke through the barrier separating the Gaza Strip from Israel, broke through it, went under it, went over it. Paragliders, bulldozers, explosives. They got through the first level of perimeter posts that are going up the road in several directions. They had detailed instructions that later turned out. Some guy entered the waiting room. I'm going to let the next one in. There were detailed instructions, it turns out. They were split up into teams, went to about 24 different towns and farming villages and the rest. And it turned out they had maps of those places, building by building, with the names and ages of all the inhabitants. It turns out they had gotten these from Gazan workers who were working on the farms and went around through the towns. And then they went house to house and murdered. They They burned some of them alive. They knifed some of them. They shot some of them. They shot anti-tank weapons into some of the rooms. In some cases, in many cases, they grabbed them, they tied them up, they tortured them, and then killed them. They took families, tied up the parents on one side, the children on the other side, gouged out eyes, cut off limbs, and then I don't know which order it was in because the autopsies aren't good enough to tell us that. But then they killed them in front of one another. In some cases, they tortured them, then burned them alive. We know this. There's one charred set of remains that when forensics was going through it, they discovered that there were two spines. There was a mother burned with her child. So, the temperature was intense enough that it was one charred lump. Just adopted the dog. We adopted the dog from a couple. They're both in the reserves. The wife works, as it turns out, for forensics. Right. So this is what she's been doing for the last month, is going in and looking at things that no human being should have to see. Right. So he's not in any shape to take care of the dog anymore. But Steele is happy with us. There were, it's fairly clear from the remains, from the witness accounts, there were witnesses that escaped. Right, one of the big attacks was on a rave that was somewhere nearby. There were several thousand people attending the rave. The Hamas terrorists, I shouldn't say Hamas terrorists because they were mostly Hamas, but they were also terrorists from other organizations, certainly Islamic Jihad, apparently also the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and there were apparently civilians who went along for the ride, several sadistic and depraved individuals who thought, let's go have some fun. And they opened up fire at the rave. Several hundred bodies were found there, but many of them also managed to run into the woods and the bushes and escape. So from there we have a lot of eyewitness accounts. Many of the terrorists were wearing GoPros, and those that were intercepted before they made it back to Gaza were eventually they were either shot, killed, or captured, and so we have some of those films. There were intercepts of cell phone conversations, some of which are quite shocking. There's apparently a kid that went along. What his age is, I can't tell you, but from the sound of it, he was a teenager. Right? Calls up, very excited, says, "Mom, Dad, you won't believe it. I just killed 10 Jews with my own hands. I'm not lying. Really? Aren't you proud of me?" And, it's quite ample intelligence, quite ample evidence of what happened. There was more evidence that was recovered afterwards, after Israeli troops entered northern Gaza. They were able to find, not only they were able to retrieve one of the 246 hostages at the time. They were also able to recover plans, right? That it wasn't just the instructions that some of the terrorists were holding when they were killed and their bodies found. It was also, there were plans that were found that were more detailed. So it's a fairly clear picture we have of the crimes that were committed, the planning to carry out the crimes, and the the length of time it took to plan all this, which was several years. This is apparently 2 years in the making. Now, so what kinds of crimes are we talking about here? Now, here I'm going to talk about the law, but here I have to begin with a little bit of a caveat about what sort of law it is that we're talking about. I'm going to be talking about international criminal law. Studied international criminal law? Not a one of you. Good. You're spared. You're lucky. All right. International law in general is a very, very strange subject. It's not really law in the way you ordinarily think of law. There's no lawmaker. In almost all cases, there's no enforcement. It's often not even clear what the law is. Right? The main type of international law that interests us is something that's called international customary law, which is those things that states do because they believe they are required to do them according to law, which is incredibly vague and makes it almost always possible to argue about the content of the law. International criminal law is not criminal law in the way you think of it, because let's say in the ordinary sense of criminal law, right? The law says don't do X. If you do X, then there's some criminal proceeding, a legal proceeding, in which you can be brought to court. There's evidence produced against you, right? And then there's a punishment that's specified in the law if you're found guilty. International criminal law doesn't have that. It just says these are the crimes. Now, what happens if you've committed a crime? Well, for the most part, the way international criminal court works, criminal law works, is it says to states, please punish the individuals who have committed these crimes, because for the most part, there's no capacity of any international institution to punish these things. There's no specified way of punishing it, and no specified punishments, and no capacity for anyone to actually put people in jail or do whatever else they're supposed to do. Right? So it's really it's put out there something that's wrong without a very clear picture of what's supposed to happen after we know it's wrong. That said, there are some fairly clear international crimes. The concept started roughly about 100 years ago. And by this point, you've built up a whole series of categories of crimes. The major ones that interest us are two types of crimes that were punished in the Nuremberg tribunals, right? That were used against the Nazis. And those are war crimes and crimes against humanity. Basically, crimes against humanity are really horrible human rights violations. War crimes are crimes that are horrible violations of the laws of war. And Hamas committed various kinds of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, there's a crime that didn't exist at the time of the Nuremberg Tribunal, so it was not in any of those categories. It was a crime that was created because of the Nazis, and because of what the Nazis did, and there was no crime to fit it. So it's a crime called genocide. Right? Hamas committed crimes of genocide. And then there's crimes that didn't exist until much later, crimes of terrorism. There's about almost 20 treaties now on crimes of terrorism. There's Security Council resolutions starting roughly in September 2001. You can probably guess why that's the magic date. And there's even some special tribunal cases. Right? There's a case of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which involved an assassination carried out by Hezbollah. The court determined that there is an international customary crime of terrorism, irrespective of what's written in the treaties, right? In addition to whatever it's in. Hamas committed 4 different categories of crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and terrorism. And I'll tell you very briefly about each of these. So, war crimes. The idea of war crimes, the truth is that war crimes is a little bit difficult to get our brains around because the framework in which you have to analyze these things is not, I don't think it's intuitive. Most of the war crimes that we understand are based on a moral theory of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, you guys have heard. Have you actually read Thomas Aquinas? Wait. This is University of Chicago. This is all right. Like you have to read it in the original Latin. Okay. So Thomas Aquinas has a book in which it's moral puzzles. Right? He says, here's the situation. What should be, huh? Okay. Here's a moral puzzle. What should be the moral framework by which we examine this? And he's got one that he says basically the moral puzzle is, what do we do when there's an action that we want to take that has good effects and bad effects, and we have to figure out whether we're allowed to take this action morally. And this is now known as the double effects problem. And he has an answer. When can you take an action that you know will result in good and bad? And more or less his answer, I'm going to touch it down to something small and manageable. More or less what he says is, you can do this thing that has a good effect and a bad effect if your intent is the good, even though you know with certainty the bad will happen. And second of all, the good outweighs the bad. Right? There's more good resulting than there is bad resulting. And now that more or less is the model of modern laws of war. Okay? Except now you have to translate this in your head to something a little bit more macabre. Right? What is good in the moral framework of the laws of war? It's killing the right people and destroying the right things. That's so it requires you to accept, in a certain sense, that there are moral things we accomplish by killing and destroying in war. But if you accept that framework, and that is the framework by which all of the laws of war are set up, you can take an action in war if your aim is good. That is, you are aiming to kill combatants or persons involved in combat on the other side, or if you're aiming to destroy objects that serve the military purposes of the other side. Those are good things. And you may do so even though you know with certainty that bad will result. What is bad? Bad in the framework of the laws of war is knowing that there will be collateral damage, that is, civilians will die, protected objects will be destroyed. You may do so, right? You may attack these things, kill these people, knowing that there will be collateral damage, so long as the collateral damage is not clearly excessive in relation to the military gain. That's more or less the framework of the laws of war. All right, so did the Hamas terrorists commit war crimes? Of course they did. Right? Of course they did, because They did not aim at the good, right? They did not aim to kill combatants only. They aimed to kill whoever they got their hands on. And in some cases, quite shockingly, right? I'm not going to show you any of the horrible films that have been released about what they did, but there's one, you watch these things and you can't get them out of your head afterwards. So you have these films where like they're arguing about who to kill, right? They catch some people the rave. One of them is an Arab security guard. So they start going back and forth. Should we kill him? He's not Jewish. He's an Arab. Yeah, but he's here with the Jews. They go back and forth and they end up killing him. Okay, now, it's very clear that none of this discussion has anything to do with, is he involved in combat, right? Is he a combatant? Of course he's not. It has to do with his ethnic identity, right? That's why they're killing. They're killing people based on ethnic identity, right? And then you have these ones where there's another film. So this one is, there's a guy, he's clearly been shot in the stomach. He's bleeding profusely. And one of the terrorists goes and grabs a hoe to see if he can behead him. And he fails to do so. It's not a good implement. So he keeps going at it. Right? Very clear, right? There's no good intent in the sense of the laws of war. That is, these are not acts aimed at killing combatants. They're aimed at killing civilians. Now, there are other laws of war that are involved here, and Hamas, went through the litany of them. So not only they aim to kill civilians, they shot at ambulances, intending to shoot at ambulances, right, which is something that's called attacking protected humanitarian targets. They used ambulances to ferry people, which is abusing humanitarian symbols. They killed with particular cruelty, which involves another principle of the laws of war called humanity. They tortured, they mutilated, they raped. All these things are independently war crimes. Now, they also committed crimes against humanity, right? Human rights violations that are quite severe. Some of these, like the rape, the torture, the mutilation, those are also human rights violations. Murdering civilians outside the framework of war is also a human rights violation. Killing people or maltreating them on the basis of their ethnicity, the way they're going back and forth. This is Jew, can we kill him or not? That's something called persecution. That's also a crime against humanity. And then, of course, there's the hostages they took. Taking hostages is both a war crime and a human rights crime. The human rights crime is forced disappearance. It's the same thing. And it's both seizing them and holding them. They're two separate crimes. Now, in addition to all those, there are the crimes of terrorism. Crimes of terrorism are more or less, there's several related definitions that you'll find in the treaties, but let's say here's the one that's in the International Conventions for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism. It is a killing of civilians that is intended to compel a state or an international organization to do or not do a thing. So it's fairly clear that Hamas commits and committed on that day acts of terrorism. That Hamas is a terrorist organization is recognized by a large number of states in the world, including by the European Union, the United States, Israel, you name it. And of course, there are the crimes of genocide. Now, the crimes of genocide are defined in the Genocide Convention. The crimes are when intending to kill a people in whole or in part as such, carrying out any of a number of acts, including killing. So if you kill somebody, if I kill somebody with the intent that I want to destroy all the Jewish people or kill all the Jewish people in Israel, I am killing with the intent of destroying a people in part as such. That's a crime of genocide. All right, now you have this list here. Now, what does all this tell us? And the answer is it doesn't tell us very much at all. And the reason it doesn't tell us very much at all is because these things, these crimes are basically unenforceable. There is an institution called the International Criminal Court. It does not have jurisdiction over these crimes because Israel is not a party to the court's treaty, and there is no state of Palestine. The court has said that it has jurisdiction because it's decided that it recognizes Palestine for the purpose of giving itself jurisdiction, but then it announced that its standard, right, Karim Khan, the prosecutor for the court, showed up at the border of Gaza about a week and a half ago and then gave a press conference in Cairo, and he announced that he was investigating. He wasn't sure if he was going to do anything about the alleged Hamas crimes, he said, because they hadn't been proved. And he was looking into Israeli military actions, and on that, Israel had not proved yet that it had acted lawfully. I think should strike you. Wait. I thought burden of reasonable doubt, the elements of the crime. So wait, why is it that Israeli defendants would have to prove their innocence? No explanation. So I think you know what's going to come out of the International Criminal Court. There's no proof is ever going to be found enough to present any charges against any Hamas defendants. I can guarantee you there will be charges against Israelis, and I can also tell you that they won't have to ever worry about proving them in court because no Israeli will be stupid enough to present himself in court to have to prove his innocence. All right. Now, that's the picture on the one side. What about the other side? Well, when Hamas carried out these atrocities, it did so in the form of invading Israeli territory, launching a war. Right? A war that's been continued ever since. Now, Israel has a slightly different approach to these matters. Israel is all lawyered up, and military operations go through endless numbers of lawyers. Many of whom I've had long arguments with. But more or less, Israel's response was one that the lawyers signed off on, which is that it involved a decision that Israel has a right to defend itself militarily, right? Which it does. Which means we transition to the morality of war, Aquinas, double effects. And then that means that Israel has to, for every operation, find lawful targets, that is, combatants or people involved in combat, or objects that are being used to serve the enemy's military purpose. And then Israel may kill or destroy, so long as the collateral damage is not expected to be excessive. Right? Now, what does excessive mean? Now, this, welcome to the world of international law. Everything is vague. There are no clear answers. But it's a concept in international customary law, which means it is the things that states do believing that it is the law. So how do you know what's excessive? The answer is what military commanders in law-abiding states do. Right? So if your model, as it is for the Israeli lawyers, is, let's say, what U.S. troops did in Iraq when fighting Daesh or ISIS, then collateral damage is quite extensive before it gets to be excessive. Now, there's this argument that goes around, like, how many people can you kill collaterally before it's a problem? So there's an analyst who used to work for the DIA, not DIA, not CIA. And then he went on to work for Defense Intelligence Agency. And then he went on to work for Human Rights Watch, where he worked, like most of the people that work for Human Rights Watch on the Israel brief, basically more or less put out continuous accusations against Israel, ignoring the laws of war. Now, his name is Mark Alasko, and what's funny about it is, while he was doing the anti-Israel propaganda, which he accused Israel of disproportionate damage, he gave an interview about what he did when he was working for the U.S. government. And it turns out that what he used to do was he would be in charge of drone strikes in Iraq in the second Gulf War, against high-value targets. That is, people who were senior in the Ba'ath Party or in the military. And his guidelines, he said, were this. What he was instructed was, if he could isolate a target where there were fewer than 30 civilians around that person, he could go strike immediately. Right? That's obvious. If it's fewer than 30 collateral civilians killed, obviously lawful. If it was 30 or more, then he was instructed to get permission from the White House, the Pentagon. Right? It might be okay. Right? Killing, let's say, 40 people, 40 civilians to get one person, one high-value target. That might be okay, and it might be excessive. You don't know. You have to ask the Secretary of Defense, right, or the White House. These are the guidelines he was operating, and I can guarantee you, there's no way that a military lawyer in Israel would ever sign off on 29 collateral expected civilian deaths to a single target. Never happened. Right? So, as it turns out, Israel's interpretation of these things is stricter with the Israeli armed forces than U.S. lawyers are with U.S. armed forces. But at any rate, that is the way that Israel operates. And so here we are, a month into this war. We have this mass atrocity that was committed by Hamas. You have these continuing crimes that are committed by Hamas. They continue to target civilians by rockets. They continue to hold hostages. They continue to use human shields. They continue to abuse humanitarian facilities. So one of the worst kept secrets in the world is that the command headquarters for Hamas is in the basement of Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. And this is so well known that it was appearing in reports 15 years ago. There's an even better one. I was looking this up the other day. in 2014, Amnesty International published a report in which it said, by the way, this is like, it's on page 18 of 60, but it says, oh, by the way, in Shifa Hospital, it's not only that they have headquarters and offices there. There were rooms they were using, abandoned outpatient clinics as torture chambers for domestic opponents. Right? This is the Amnesty International we're talking about. Like Amnesty International in general is pretty well known for its great sympathy for the Palestinians and much less sympathy for Israel. But it's not a secret to do this. So you have Hamas continuing to carry out crimes, and you have Israel following still a fairly strict legal process by which it's doing less than U.S. forces would do under similar circumstances, and therefore the headlines are full of charges of whose crimes? Israel's, of course. And now, why is that? One of the reasons why that is, and this is the last thing that I want to talk about, is that it's in fact a fairly central part of the strategy of Hamas carrying out this and every other engagement, is making accusations like this and spreading them through an international network. Some collaborators and some just dupes, people who should know better but do not. And there's a purpose behind this, right? Hamas, in carrying out terrorist attacks, doesn't believe that in carrying out a terrorist attack, it's going to destroy the Israeli army or close the gap in military abilities. The idea is to demoralize the enemy with the idea that Hamas will survive to continue doing so because at some point, the United States and the democratic nations of the world will come and pressure Israel to stop military action. Why? Because Hamas is accusing them of war crimes, striking civilians, of striking hospitals and ambulances, of carrying out collective punishment, of this is the height of gall. Hamas is accusing Israelis of committing genocide. Now, there's the particular crimes they choose. Collective punishment, by the way, collective punishment. This is not a new claim of Hamas. You go back to the Hamas Charter, right? It describes the crimes of Jews, right? So Jews control money, and they're behind every war that has ever taken place, and all Jews have to be killed on the day of judgment, and some of them beforehand. And it tells us that Jews are particularly evil. When they conquered Jerusalem, they went up to the Temple Mount, which they call Haram al-Sharif, and they said, Muhammad is a woman. I don't know why this particular one, but whatever. And the Jews carry out collective punishment. Now, these are very bizarre claims, but they're consistent over time. Right? Now, what's the idea of, let's say, claiming that the Jews are carrying out genocide? One of these things is, it's an attribution of evil characteristics to the Jews, which justifies the fact that Jews have to be killed on the day of judgment beforehand. And part of it is a way of answering without answering charges that Hamas, after Hamas commits acts of genocide. Their answer is, you do too. right? Which is not really an answer, but it's sort of a rhetorical answer. But most of all, what it is it's a way of silencing criticism. Because if you look at what has happened over the last month, you will notice something that's quite interesting. You know, people talk about what Hamas did, describe it as depraved or inhuman. It is, right? Um, and the response is, well, the minister of so-and-so in Israel described this behavior as animal behavior. That proves that Israel is seeking to dehumanize all Palestinians as part of the secret genocide plan. Right? The idea is that an Israeli who makes a criticism of the depraved behavior of Palestinian terrorists has therefore created the evidence of genocide. So what does that mean? If you're an Israeli politician, if you're an Israeli public figure, you can't say these things. If you do, you're proving the evil of Israel. It's a way of silencing criticism. And it's quite effective. Israelis are afraid to speak. All right. That is what I had to say about atrocities, the laws of war, and the war in Gaza more generally. Now tell me what you want to talk about. Oh, wait, let me just ask this gentleman behind
Well, I've you, but I've heard to clarify question.
Yeah.
In the laws of war, how are like is it subjective based on the military? Because I know that like Hamas or like very like generally on the ground.
Yeah, they're all combatants, right?
Or
So,
they might even argue that like maybe people less staying settlements.
right. So Hamas, this is one of Hamas's things that it says. It says we didn't kill any civilians; they were all combatants. The babies whose heads we chopped off, combatants, right? The families that we burned alive, combatants, all combatants. Now, there are basically two kinds of, I shouldn't call them combatants, two kinds of people that can be legitimately targeted under the laws of war. One of them is combatant in the sense of they are members of armed forces, organized armed forces, with the exception of basically medical personnel and clergy. Everybody else, if you're in the armed forces, if you're active in the armed forces, then you are a combatant, right? So if you're a soldier and you're sitting down on a cigarette break, you're a combatant. Until the point where you turn in your uniform and your gun, you go home, then you're no longer a combatant. Okay. If you're a member of Hamas, which is an armed organization, then you are a combatant. Okay. Second kind of person that can be targeted is a non-combatant who is at that moment participating in the hostilities. Now, this one is much vaguer. What does it mean to participate in hostilities? So obviously, if you're shooting, you're participating in hostilities. But if you're intelligence gathering, you're participating in the hostilities. If you are, so for example, right, somebody who ran up to the fence to like see at what point an Israeli soldier on the other side would raise a gun and runs back and reports, right? That's participating in the hostilities. A spotter who's sitting in a porch from above says, I can see them moving that way. That's participating in hostilities. Participating in hostilities is bringing munitions from place to place or supplies from place to place for combatants. Right now, the thing is, at the moment you stop doing this, you're no longer a legitimate target because if you're a non-combatant, it's only in the moments when you're participating in hostilities. All right, so let's flip this to the other side. So Hamas, do they have a decent argument under law that that anybody who lives in the kibbutz of Be'eri, or anyone who lives in a residential community in the West Bank or wherever is a combatant? Not according to any understanding of the concepts that I know. Okay? Yeah. Yes.
Take the microphone. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
what's it called? So just two things. One's a little more quick. What about the accusations about the use of like chemical weapons like phosphorus is something I hear all the time, and I know it's like we're a little unclear as to like if it's being used or not.
Okay. So there are forbidden weapons in the laws of war, mostly by treaty. Okay, so like poison gases. White phosphorus is not the subject of any treaty. There are several organizations like Human Rights Watch that have been campaigned to make white phosphorus illegal. Human Rights Watch, for example, wrote a report several years ago in which it said that it's true that white phosphorus is not covered. There's a treaty on what's called incendiary weapons. It's basically like things like napalm, right? Incendiary weapons have legal uses and illegal uses. You can only use them in certain contexts. White phosphorus is apparently not an incendiary weapon, or at least the way that incendiary weapons are defined in the treaty. They're not covered. And Human Rights Watch says it's terrible. We have to change the treaty because white phosphorus should not be legal. Then, like close that report, go to the next report. The next report is about Israel using white phosphorus. This is different, right? In a different conflict. And they say, well, Israel's breaking the law because everybody knows that white phosphorus is illegal. But wait, didn't you just say everybody knows that it is legal and that's why we want to change the law? Yes, that's exactly what they said, right? So Israel does not use illegal weapons. Israel uses legal weapons. And it would be practically impossible for Israel to procure weapons and get it past the army lawyers if they were illegal weapons. It's just not possible to procure them. Now, every weapon can be used legally and illegally, right? If you take a gun, lawful weapon, and you use it to murder civilians, then it's a lawful weapon being used illegally. Now, in this particular conflict, when the question was last asked, about 2 weeks ago, Israel said it had not used white phosphorus in Gaza. I tend to believe that that was true at that time. I have no idea. I haven't seen the question posed in the last few weeks. So I don't know if Israel is currently using or not using it. There are lawful uses of it in the Gaza Strip. And the accusations are basically based on failing to know the law. I was on Indian TV the other day, okay? And the interviewer asked me about Israel using white phosphorus and what she called poisonous tear gas. You guys know what tear gas is, right? Right? It's not a poisonous weapon, right? So yes, Israel uses tear gas. Yes, Israel has used white phosphorus, although as far as I know, it hasn't used in Gaza. Both are legal weapons. Last one.
I just wanted to clarify maybe what the use of human shields. And I guess like if they're using like a ton of people, let's say a number that exceeds the civilian casualties that we would permit for killing, let's say like one Hamas commander, are we now no longer allowed to target them because they're using human shields? Like, how does that work? Is it now our fault if we strike them when they're using human shields? Is it legally their fault?
So here, let's take something like Shifa Hospital. Okay, so in general, a hospital is a protected structure. You may not attack a hospital. However, the rule is that any structure that is being used for military purposes by the enemy loses its automatic protection. So now Shifa Hospital is no longer protected according to the laws of war. But the lawful target is not the hospital. The lawful target is those parts of the hospital that are being used for military purposes by Hamas. Right. So now you have all these people that are patients in the hospital that are civilians. They're not involved in hostilities. They're there because why? I mean, why did Hamas put the control headquarters in the basement of Shifa, right? In order to use the patients as shields. So is it a lawful target? And this depends now on, is the collateral damage expected to be excessive? Now, this is not a scientific matter because there's no measurement. There's this great quote by the late Justice Scalia, who's talking about legal balancing tests. And he says, they're asking you, is this rock heavier than that string is long? These are incommensurables. They don't. It doesn't make any sense, right? Is the collateral damage excessive in relation to the military gains? These are incommensurable things. But to the degree that military commanders have a sense of such things, I can tell you that if the hospital is full, most commanders will say not a legitimate target. If the hospital is mostly emptied out, but there are still some patients there, then they would say, no, it's a legitimate target. Okay, does it make a difference that the patients are there because they're human shields of Hamas? The answer is not really, right? It's still the same calculus. The only thing is that because Hamas uses human shields, I can tell you that there are going to be, when Israel attacks Shifa Hospital, because it's been sufficiently, emptied out, there will be collateral damage. There will be civilians who die as a result of the attack. They will die lawfully, right? That is within the calculus of the morality of the laws of war, right? It's an acceptable amount of civilians dying because it's not excessive, right? Now, why is that lawful? It's lawful because they placed, right? There were enough removed where the human shields that are there are now within the bounds of not excessive. Who's responsible for their deaths? Here we're getting into the metaphysics of war, but I would say if you employ human shields, you're getting people killed. That's your point. That's right. Yeah. Sorry. This guy has been patient. Oh. Yeah. Yeah.
You started off by demonstrating that the Hamas attack on October 7th constitutes a war crime and a crime against humanity.
Multiple war crimes, multiple crimes against humanity, multiple crimes of genocide, multiple crimes of terrorism. Yes.
Right. So Israel responds. Now let me offer a what if. Suppose on October 7th, Hamas had breached the border and had attacked IDF military bases and had restricted themselves to military targets. And suppose that they had once again caught Israel with its hands down. The operation was successful, and they were able to kill a large number of people and take hostages.
Well, how's it? You want to eliminate the war crimes? They can't take hostages. Hostage taking, even of soldiers, is a war crime.
Fine. So they didn't take hostages.
Yes.
My question is, between these two cases, between the
Yes.
war crimes case and the legal war case, does that have any consequence as to what actions Israel is allowed to take in response?
So, yes, but for our purposes, no. And now I'll explain. Right. So, let's say Hamas invaded and committed no war crimes in doing so. Would Israel have a right to defend itself? Yes. Now, what is self-defense in international law? It's military force. Military force meaning exactly what we're seeing, right? That is, Israel has a right to use such military forces as militarily necessary. And what's militarily necessary is to defeat the enemy and destroy the enemy. So Israel could undertake all those operations that it's undertaking now. But in addition, because there were war crimes, this gets us into something that Israel does not do, because it's somewhat controversial, although the Brits do, for example, which is reprisals that would otherwise violate the laws of war in response to laws of war crimes. Right. So the Brits, for example, would say that if someone commits war crimes against Britain, British civilians, British soldiers, whatever, right? Then British forces have a right to undertake a proportionate reprisal that would otherwise violate the laws of war. Right? They can undertake an action that has excessive collateral damage, for example. Right? And this is hugely controversial. This practice of undertaking reprisals that would otherwise violate the laws of war. And because it's hugely controversial, if you're already subject to a double standard, you don't want to go there. So therefore, Israeli army lawyers say absolutely not, totally illegal, can't be done. The Brits say, obviously you can do it. We've always done it. That's the way it's always been.
Well, let me just press you a little bit. If you are engaging in a reprisal
Yes.
for a war crime, am I assuming correctly that a legal reprisal could not consist of doing exactly what the original act had been, that you could not
It
go
has to be, no.
throw Gaza babies into ovens?
It has to be proportionate. What does proportionate mean? Huh? Right. So what does proportionate mean? Who knows? Right. So you can, you might ask the British, would they start throwing, let's say, Nazi, like if they're fighting Nazi Germany, will they start throwing German babies into the oven? Right. You'll have to ask the Brits. Israel's not going to be doing that.
Hi, I've seen people argue that Israel turning off the electricity in other counts to move from the I was wondering what your thoughts were. Electricity or water.
So I can tell you this is one where I got into a fight with government lawyers about 10 years ago. So they were having a discussion about this about 10 years ago. And I said, let's actually back up. The government at the time wanted to continue supplying Israeli electricity and water to the Gaza Strip. And so it asked some government lawyers to come up with a legal opinion saying that Israel is required to provide electricity and water. And so I said, no, Israel's not required to supply electricity and water. Nobody's required to supply goods to an enemy territory. There's a different question if Israel's allowed to block supplies by other parties, and then gets into a whole different set of questions. But I'm going to put that aside. Is Israel required to provide electricity? No. Is Israel required to provide water? No. Is Israel required to provide food? No. Is Israel required to provide medicine? No. Is Israel required to provide medical care? No. Right? It's not required to provide anything. So now, okay, Israel has been supplying it and now decides not to supply it. Is that collective punishment? So collective punishment is one of these terms that's often used by, let's say, Palestinian critics of Israel, because it's almost impossible to find modern cases of convictions on collective punishments. Therefore, it's very difficult to define. So, like the classic case of collective punishment is, there were convictions like this of Nazis say, there was an engagement about 10 miles from this village. 2 soldiers were shot. We're going to take everybody in this village, march them out to the town square, and shoot them all dead. Right? 1,000 people dead as punishment. Don't you ever shoot at a German soldier? Right? And that's a classic case. The Germans were convicted. Right? Nazi soldiers were convicted of collective punishment. The general thought on collective punishment is it's got to be some kind of penalty, generally the kind of penalty that would be unlawful to impose, like shooting civilians. And it has to be intended as punishment. Right? Now, if Israel is not required to supply, it's hard for me to see how it could be either of those. It's not intended as a punishment to stop supply, nor is it something that would be otherwise unlawful. So it's fairly clear to me that it can't be collective punishment. Now, I think that, the more interesting one of collective punishments is the one that was stated by Secretary General Guterres. Right? He described Israel as more generally engaging in collective punishment. Why? Because many Gazan civilians are dying in this military action, and therefore it's collective punishment. Now, it's true, civilians getting killed can be lawful and not lawful. Depends, right? It's like if they're being targeted, unlawful. If they're not being targeted, they're collateral damage, then it is lawful unless it's excessive, right? But he's cutting through the whole thing. He's saying, yeah, but Israel is doing this in order to punish them. Like Israel must be intending it for it to happen because it's the certain result of it. Right? So this is flipping the way we generally understand the morality and the rules of war. The rules of war is that certain consequences are not necessarily their intent, right? That's the whole theory of Aquinas makes no sense if every known result is the intended result, because then you cannot intend the good rather than the bad. Right? Does it make sense? Right? You know both are going to happen, but only one of them is your intent. The other one is the thing you know is going to happen is you're not intending. Right? So knowing something will happen does not make it the intended result, and therefore it's not something you can say that's therefore intended as punishment. Right? Knowing for certain that if I don't provide electricity, they will have only 60% of the electricity they had before. And knowing that with certainty does not mean that my intent is to punish them by taking away 40% of their electricity. It's simply a result that I know will happen. Now, it may be you don't agree with this moral theory. I have to say, I'm not so convinced it's the right moral theory either. It's like I there's something a little bit funny about double effects. Right? That said, I also have a problem with saying that double effects is perfectly fine for everybody in the world except for the state of Israel, or double effects is good for judging everybody else's actions, but not in this one case. Right? So, want to change the theory? Okay, fine. For everybody.
Thank you for coming. And so it seems pretty clear that the international community is pro. Besides for anti-Semitism, what do you think, if there is another result, what do you think is the result of? How do you think that this can be combated? What's the best way to combat this? And
Okay, is it because of anti-Semitism? It is anti-Semitism. If somebody gives adverse treatment to Native Americans, despite believing that they're noble, wonderful people, that's not less racist, right? I mean, it's bigotry to give adverse treatment to somebody on the basis of their ethnicity, right, or identity, whether you hate them or love them, So is it because no, it is that's what we're talking about, right? If you have adverse treatment for the Jewish state as opposed to every other state in the world, that by definition is anti-Semitism. Now, let me rephrase your question. The question is it because of malice or something else? And it may be something else. Like, let's say, take a guy like Karim Khan. Okay, Karim Khan is the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. I don't get the feeling that he hates Jews. I just have the feeling that he knows how to count heads, right? He runs an institution. There are X number of Muslim states that really can't stand Israel. And then there are a whole bunch of European states that can't stand Israel either. And a whole bunch of African states that can't stand Israel. And the African case is really important for him because his court had a quite noticeable, disproportionate number of cases involving African defendants, right? And so it's particularly important for him to assuage the ill feelings there. And so he's going along with the program. The program is adverse treatment for the Jewish state. Does it mean animus towards the Jews? No, not as far as I can tell. Right? Does it make a difference? I don't think so. Right? I mean, it's not. I don't think it's really our business to try to figure out why people do the bad things they do, except if we can change their bad behavior. I don't see any way to change his behavior because I don't know how to change the political calculus. Does he get a pass for it because it's not malicious that he's being a bigot? No, I don't think so. I think that nice bigots deserve to be criticized and prevented from carrying out bigoted acts as well. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, a question about rules for engagement are in place. They could stand on the border of Gaza. So the rules were basically, even if Palestinians come against the fence and start cutting the fence, military have no right to engage them. In fact, an Israeli soldier was shot, and military was not allowed to go after whoever shot. So my question is, I mean, now that they probably Israelis probably see the errors in their ways, how do you see this sort of rules changing going forward in this the way and this, by the way, was confirmed by Israeli Supreme Court. This was challenged and confirmed by Israeli Supreme Court. Very sort of strict engagement towards. Is it going to change going?
Okay, so let me just explain one thing. All right, so this is actually, there's a general issue like this throughout the world, and I was actually reading a paper that was very interesting by some American lawyers discussing the question. It's basically when you have rules of engagement in a sensitive area, and they were saying that these Americans were saying they were attended this conference, and all the military lawyers, the first thing that they thought about rules of engagement was self-defense, right? They weren't thinking in the first question about questions of participating in hostilities. Now, everybody knows, right? If you're a soldier and somebody acts in a way that is threatening to you, that you have to use force to save your life, so it's the same as a law enforcement officer, right? A policeman. Somebody acts in a way that threatens your life or somebody else's life. You may use deadly force. And that clearly is possible. The question is, what happens if they're not acting in such a way that they're using. They're threatening you. You're a soldier. They're not acting in a way that's threatening you, but they're participating in hostilities or they're combatants, right? And if you are in a military setting, right? If you are in an armed conflict, you can use force. It doesn't make a difference what they're doing. If they're sitting down smoking a cigarette, as I said, right? You may use deadly force and kill the enemy combatant or the person who is engaging in hostile action. And it now turns out, now we can see, going back, they've been doing this for several years. The people who were organizing, running up to the fence and testing reactions, or running up to the fence, cutting and running away, right? They were engaging in hostilities, right? They were intelligence gathering for Hamas. Now, the funny thing is, this is not new to Israeli intelligence, right? So if you go back now, in I believe it was 2017, there was a guy who there's a Hamas commander who was described in the New York Times a poet, right? Who organized something called the Great Return March, which basically involved people running up to the fence to test Israeli reactions and gather intelligence. Right? At the time, Israeli intelligence said that this was an intelligence gathering operation by Palestinian terrorists. They're trying to gather information about how Israel responds to different situations at the border in order to attack. So it's not that Israel discovered this now. Israel discovered this then. Right? Nonetheless, the rules of engagement were, as you said, the rules of engagement were restrictive. The rules of engagement were that if they didn't pose a threat, not to use deadly force. Right? Now, will that change? This is actually a matter of some controversy in Israel, which is mind-boggling. Right? It seems to me obvious now. It seems to me it's obvious then that it was participating in hostilities. But it's not yet clear how it's going to go. I'm fine. As long as I keep going, the jet lag won't hit me. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. So I want to take this for a second to optimistic outcome of this conflict where Hamas surrenders.
They're not surrendering.
I know. But when we are going to get to a point where you're going to have 40,000 at least prisoners, like what are you going to do with them? I'm just wondering if international law or Israeli law even knows what happens in a situation like that, where organization of a few tens to 100,000 people, maybe, because it depends on how you define competence, is being eliminated, erased, or just curious.
Look, there's this practical problem, but as many war criminals as you capture, they're all war criminals, right? I mean, it's possible to think of other situations like this. Just they tend to fight to the death, right? So if you think about the cases of ISIS, right? Everybody in ISIS was a war criminal. It's not like there were some people that were and some people that were not. Every single one of them was, okay? And to the extent that they were caught alive, right? You could put them in front of a military tribunal, judge them as war criminals, and you could, they carry out any penalty up to the death penalty. In fact, as far as the laws of war are concerned, right, they're unprivileged combatants. You see them, you shoot them, the end of it, right? So far, what it looks like is, at least for those that have already been captured, that are right now in Israeli custody, they're going back and forth, but apparently they're going to be charged. It's not clear in what court. It's not clear with what charges. Yeah. I have to add something here. It's generally thought Israel does not have a death penalty. Israel has a death penalty in one law. In one law, which is for Nazi criminals. And everybody knows, therefore, that Israel used the death penalty in this one case, in one criminal case against Adolf Eichmann, right? They had to import a hangman from Britain because there wasn't Israel. But it turns out, I haven't paid any attention to this until a few weeks ago. There's an Israeli law that was adopted in the wake of the Genocide Convention, which is the Israeli law against genocide. If you look at the law, you will see that the punishment for an act of genocide, for a crime of genocide, is the death penalty. And I believe that the Hamas participants in the October 7th atrocities committed crimes of genocide. And I believe that the Hamas fighters in Gaza now are also participants in crimes of genocide. So the range of penalties that would be available to an Israeli court under existing law are all the way up to the death penalty. Will that happen? I don't think that's very likely that Israel's going to impose a death penalty. It's just not politically feasible.
Maybe look at someone else. Hi, thank you so much for doing this. I know this is a topic you briefly touched upon prior, but on something I've been reading is, right, how many civilian deaths, right? There's this number that people are saying, what number does international law allow,
There's no
Israel
number
to go after? But
right.
In your experience, I know it's all very relative. Is there not any form of discussion or any type of debate that's secured?
Okay, so there is a discussion like this, and it's quite absurd, right? So I told you, Mark Garlasco, he said, our rule was up to 30. More than 30, we got to get special permission. Okay. During the Obama years, the United States adopted a new rule. What's the right number of collateral deaths? 0. Now, how do you reach that number? The answer is you classify every male as a combatant afterwards, and then it turns out that magically there are no intended collateral damages, right? Like there might be females that end up dead, but that was an accident, right? And they just count the balls. Like the body counts are terrific under the system, right? It turns out almost no collateral damages, right? But that's just a game. This is not serious. Okay. Now in Israel, okay, there's a guy. He was formerly chief of staff. Right, his name is Moshe Yaalon, Bogi Yaalon. After he left the service, he went and sat in a think tank in D.C. for a little while, and he wrote this article, I think it was in the Washington Post, in which he described these discussions that they had among Army lawyers during his time to try to figure out where the number is for proportionality. And he said the lawyers came up with the magic number of 3. By the way, it was not 3, I can tell you, because I've got enough students who are there. So the magic number they were talking about was pi. Now, why pi? Because it always gives a clean result. It's always going to be more than or less than, right? 3, you could have a tie. You don't want to have a tie, right? If it's pi, then, right, no matter how many multiples you go to, right, it's always going to be a clear result. Yes or no? And the idea was, right, this way, Army lawyers can give a clear answer. You ask them, can I target this? The Army lawyers ask you, how many expected collateral damages? And you say, I think that, hang on a second, there are likely to be, 6 people around there. I have 60% confidence in my prediction, therefore 3.6, right? No, 3.6, well, that's more than pi, sorry. So wait. I decided 49% probability of my initial. Okay, now go ahead. Right? It's an idiotic thing. So they had these discussions, and it ended up the Israeli army ended up not adopting this because the whole thing is insane. Now nobody, there are discussions like this all the time. You have to have rules of thumb, but there's no good number. There can't be a good number. You know? Yeah.
When we use the international law, they're suggested. Why don't
I do not have an answer for you. No, here, let me elaborate. I am not sure that this is the moral framework that I would be using for any. Okay. That said, it is a matter of discussion. And so I think it is wise to be conversant in it. And it turns out that Israeli army lawyers are convinced that they want to abide by international law, and Israeli elected officials are convinced they want to abide by international law. And so they do. And does it make any difference that we all know that Hamas doesn't? No, it doesn't make any difference, right? Israel does it even though Hamas doesn't. Hamas doesn't. Hezbollah doesn't. You know, the truth is Egypt doesn't, Syria doesn't, Lebanon doesn't. This is the practice. Now, you want me to make an argument that everybody ought to follow international law? I can't really, because to me, when I look at what happened on October 7th, I think that it's clearly illegal under international law, but that to me is much less important. In fact, it's clearly depraved, right? I think that its immorality should shout at you no matter what you think of international law. And that to me is much more important. Yeah. Can't answer a question like that because I don't know every particular thing that's been done by any person. So it's possible a soldier did something wrong. Yeah, it's possible that bad order was given. Yeah, it's possible. Right? Because I don't know everything. But you ask me of any of the things that have been talked about. Do I think that Israel acted wrongly by stopping to supply electricity and water? No. Do I think that Israel acted badly by imposing a siege? No. It's not just that did Israel act lawfully; it did act. But besides that, like morally within the context, no, I don't think that it was wrong. I think that it's right. I'll tell you more than that. It's like there's, in the first Gulf War, they asked Colin Powell, what's the strategy? He said, oh, it's really simple military strategy. It's about the Iraqi army. We're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it. Right? And that's, what do you do in war? You cut off supply lines. You isolate the target, in this case, Hamas, right? And then when it's weakened, you destroy it, right? Do I think that that's a moral and right thing to do? In this world, in which we don't have available tools other than military force, yes. Now, if there were, like some magic spell that I could use, I could make them all unconditionally surrender, and I wouldn't have to use military force at all. Wave a wand, and all of a sudden they like march out, with their hands up, and hand over all the hostages and destroy all their weapons. Then I would do that, and then nobody would have to die. But we don't have better tools in that context. I think that Israel's acted properly.
Can you imagine?
Okay, let's start this like this. Can Israel agree to a ceasefire? humanitarian pause is the same thing as a ceasefire. Most Israelis think the answer is absolutely not, right? Not until, the mission is to destroy Hamas. It's right. And so if it's not accomplished yet, then why would we cease using force? But that's not the politics of it. The politics of it is there are several hundred families with members of their family being held hostage in the Gaza Strip. And they're not going to bless any ceasefire that doesn't have the hostages released. And if they don't bless it, then it's going to be really hard for any politician in Israel to agree to it, because, with all due respect for, whatever Secretary Blinken says, he's not going to be voting for them. But the families of these people, right, and all the Israelis who sympathize with them, which is an overwhelming majority of the country, they are going to be voting. And the idea of just abandoning them by saying, okay, all right, stop with, Blinken says no more. Sorry, they're just going to have to continue to be held hostage in Gaza. That's just not going to fly. So it's very difficult for me to perceive a circumstance in which it's politically plausible in Israel to agree to a ceasefire unless all the hostages are released, which they're not going to. Hamas will never agree. I don't think it's either, maintaining support or saying damn everyone. It is, there are lots of things that Israel wants to try to accomplish. The most important things are destroying Hamas, getting the hostages out. And that's more important than smiles from, the UK and the US. So optimally, you try to accomplish all of these things. But if you can't accomplish all of them, you have to start prioritizing. And it's pretty clear what has to be at the top of the priority list.
Thank you very much to Avi. Thank you for making the trip, which was, I know, was a complicated journey from Israel to Chicago back to DC. And thank you, Rabbi Mendel, for organizing, and to Jay. Thank you.
And thank you for staying so late.
Yes, thank you.